Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our second video on disorders and abnormal psychology. Today, this will be fun. We're jumping into specific disorders and what they look like, their symptoms, how they are diagnosed, and why they happen in the first place. In this first video today, we are looking at a certain category of disorders, the category of anxiety disorders. We're also going to talk about some other ones that are related, specifically OCD, which is obsessive compulsive disorder, and PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. Those are not, technically speaking, according to the DSM-5, classified as anxiety disorders, but they're extremely similar. So we're talking about them at the same time. Here we go. So in general, anxiety disorders, this is a group of disorders. So it's it's a category in the DSM-5. The DSM-5 has a lot of different categories of disorders. Anxiety is one category. And it's a category, a group of disorders characterized by distressing, persistent anxiety, just like you would think. Or maladaptive behaviors that reduce anxiety. So remember, when we talk about maladaptive behaviors, we're talking about behaviors that are preventing you from living a normal life in some way. So they're so strange or severe or different or harmful to you that they're preventing that normal existence. Big ones to know for anxiety disorders are GAD, which is generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorders, and phobias. And we're going to talk about each of those in these next few slides. And again, OCD and PTSD, they do heavily involve anxiety, so we're talking about them at the same time, but they are not themselves classified as anxiety disorders by the DSM-5. So first, we have GAD, or generalized anxiety disorder. So this is when a person is constantly tense or apprehensive, or just generally their autonomic nervous system is revved up. They are ready to go, especially their sympathetic nervous system. They're just constantly on guard, anxious, tense. Think for a second about how this would affect you if you were constantly super stressed, if you were constantly, and I'm not talking about just like the general stress that comes with life. We all have stress that we deal with as we move through life. This is different. This is a level of freaked outedness that is constant. Imagine, for example, think about something that really freaks you out, that stresses you. So for a lot of people, it might be public speaking, for example. And that feeling you have in the pit of your stomach right before you stand up to give a speech in a class, let's say. You're extremely tense, you're anxious, your heart rate is going, you maybe are breathing a little bit quicker. People with GAD are feeling this all the time. It's constant. And this constant state of arousal really can start to wear you down after a while. This is a video we're about to watch you're going to get a little break from my voice. This is a man, a psychologist, who's going to explain to you a little bit about GAD and give you some examples as well. Here we go.
Everyone experiences some stress in their life. How can you tell if what you're experiencing is just regular stress or if it's general anxiety disorder?
What differentiates generalized anxiety disorder from normal stress is an excessive, exaggerated worry about everyday life events. People with generalized anxiety disorder are anxious in a way that's out of proportion with what's happening. When someone has GAD, a constant state of worry and dread comes to dominate that person's thinking.
So that part that he just said is important. It's out of proportion with what your environment should, could, or would dictate. It's not a reasonable response to your environment, this anxiety.
So much so that it interferes with regular daily functions like work, school, and relationships. Symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder can be similar to stress, but more intense. Some key symptoms of GAD include excessive, ongoing worry, restlessness, irritability, muscle tension, and headaches. Most sufferers also experience difficulty concentrating and have trouble sleeping. About 10 million adult Americans suffer from GAD during the course of a year. Most often begins in childhood or adolescence, but can begin in adulthood and is more common in women than in men. Most people who have had GAD are likely to experience it again. The exact cause of generalized anxiety disorder is not fully known, but a number of factors appear to contribute to its development. Research suggests that family history plays a part in whether a person will develop GAD. This means that the tendency to develop GAD may be passed on in families. GAD has also been associated with abnormal levels of certain neurotransmitters in the brain. Neurotransmitters are special chemical messengers that help move information from nerve cells.
I'm going to cut this dude off because I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, and you know what a neurotransmitter is. One other thing that he didn't mention that I think is really interesting, many people who suffer from GAD had difficult childhoods. They were abused or mistreated as children, and that environmental experience, there is a strong correlation between that and people later in life developing GAD. So two other anxiety disorders that are very important for you to know. The first is panic disorder, and this is exactly what it sounds like. You have, at random, unpredictable times, several minutes long episodes of where you are just intensely freaked out and panicking. And again, this isn't just like when someone says, like, you joke around like, oh my God, I'm panicking right now. This is actually like you cannot deal with whatever is around you right now. You are freaking out. Chest pain, choking, and other physical sensations that are frightening to you, that if it were happening to you, you would be extremely uncomfortable and freaked out about. Those accompany these panic attacks. Interestingly enough, this is a nice little plug for why you should not be smoking. You are much more likely to develop panic disorder if you are a smoker. The second one is phobias. We've all heard of these probably. A phobia is a constant, persistent fear that you have, generally of something in particular, an object, an activity, a situation, so on and so forth. And it's not rational. There's no reason for you to be freaked out about this specific thing, and yet you are. So sometimes you might hear someone say, like as a figure of speech, I have a phobia of heights. Not really, unless you just the thought of heights or even being on the second floor of a building causes you to curl up on the ball and the floor and freak out. You don't actually have a phobia of heights. People say I have a phobia of flying in an airplane. Not unless you can't literally get near an airplane, like physically you cannot bring yourself to do so, do you actually have that phobia. Some common ones: animals, you have phobia of rats, of dogs, so on and so forth. Insects is a big phobia. Like I said, heights, some people do actually have that phobia, but just because they say they do doesn't mean they do. Blood is a huge one, and enclosed spaces. People can be extremely uncomfortable and freaked out by being in like a walk-in closet, for example. One note about this, a common phobia that is sort of misunderstood is called agoraphobia. Its definition has even kind of changed somewhat as the DSM has been revised throughout the years. We think of agoraphobia as being either afraid of strangers or afraid of wide open spaces, generally speaking. That's how I learned what agoraphobia was. In actuality, agoraphobia is a fear of any situation where you might have an anxiety attack. So if you have, for example, panic disorder, and you have these panic attacks, you can develop agoraphobia, which is a fear of any situation that might cause that panic attack to come on for you. Related also to this is social anxiety disorder, and this is exactly what you would think of. So you have this intense overriding fear of social situations. And this is different, again, from just being shy or being an introvert. And if you have social anxiety disorder, you don't leave your house, maybe, or you walk around like refusing to talk to anyone at all, ever, because you have this problem. Moving away from these kind of this category of disorders, of anxiety disorders, but sticking with the anxiety theme, we have OCD, one of the most commonly thought about disorders. You'll recognize Mr. Mandel. We watched a video about him last week. He has OCD. OCD is characterized by unwanted repetitive, so they're ongoing, thoughts, which are your obsessions, and or actions related to those thoughts, which are compulsions. 2 to 3% of people in our country will have this disorder at some point in their lives. And so here's what let's unpack this a little bit. So you have these unwanted thoughts, you have these obsessions, which lead to these actions. They're not always linked, but they are very oftentimes linked. You've got some examples of common obsessions and common compulsions on the screen in front of you right now. So let's say, for example, you have this obsession with germs, like Howie does. He talked about he shaved his dang head because he was so obsessed with the thought of germs. Constantly, you're thinking about germs. You're constantly worrying about germs. You're freaked out about germs. You have anxiety about germs. This obsession with germs leads to a compulsion that is constant hand washing every 60 seconds. Let's say you just can't go a minute without washing your hands. And this, if you don't give into this compulsion, this behavior, this obsession will start to snowball in an OCD person's mind. They will start to have more and more anxiety. Again, this is a generalization. OCD can take different forms in this, but this is one very common way. If you've ever seen the TV show Hoarders on A&E, that's another form of OCD. People who have this compulsion of just hoarding objects. They can never throw anything away. Actually, my grandmother had this. She was a hoarder. And when she died, we went into her basement and my parents found the dead skeleton of a cat that had been living with my grandmother when my parents were in college. So this was 2 decades later. They found this cat's skeleton because my grandmother had so much stuff in her basement that she wasn't even aware that an animal had gotten in there and died. That is how severe this can be. Last one is PTSD that we're going to talk about today. PTSD is short for post-traumatic stress disorder. This is one that we've learned a lot more about in the last, I'd say 10 or 20 years, one that's in the news a lot right now for a reason that I'll talk about in a sec here. PTSD is very often caused by a traumatic experience, always I should say, caused by a traumatic experience. What we mean by a traumatic experience is something that is extremely disturbing or bothersome to you. After that experience happens, you have haunting memories or nightmares. You'll withdraw socially. You might have problems regulating your emotions. You'll get jumpy a lot, so you'll always be on guard. Someone will you might, if somebody, I don't know, let's say you're at a restaurant and somebody with PTSD is eating, a waiter drops a glass in sort of behind them. That person will freak out. They might jump out of their chair because they're so jumpy. Numbness of feeling, again, difficulty with emotions, and insomnia, which is trouble sleeping, all happen in PTSD. One other key component of this is that PTSD, for it to be diagnosed, has to linger for at least 4 weeks after this traumatic experience. So if you have a traumatic experience, like let's say a really brutal car crash that you're involved in, it's a completely normal human response to have a few nights, a week or so, where you have really hard trouble sleeping and the images of that car crash are flashing in your mind constantly. You don't have PTSD until we get to this 4-week mark. PTSD is really in the news now for a very sad reason. Our country has fought 2 wars in the last 15 years or so, and those wars have caused veterans to have some serious PTSD issues. 1 out of every 6 Iraq War veterans has PTSD. This guy right now is a veteran, maybe of Iraq or maybe of Afghanistan. I'm going to push play here so you can hear him talk about how his PTSD affected him.
Whatever options I thought I had were taken away from me. I got in a bunch of legal trouble. I did some things that, some domestic violence issues, and I set my house on fire because I thought my wife was an insurgent. I was forced into medical care. So I did not willingly seek it out. But I needed it. And finally I was appropriately diagnosed with both traumatic brain injury and severe post-traumatic stress. And so it was a lot of just going through all these things, in excruciating detail. I guess it's called exposure therapy.
Aha! So you are hearing him now talk about our therapies that we discussed last week, bringing them back in now and hearing how they are used to treat a specific disorder. We'll be thinking more about those as we continue to move through this unit.
And I had to write a lot of it down. I wrote down, hundreds of pages of experiences and things that I saw, things that I experienced, and things that I did to sort of get it all out of my system. So I'm much more functional now. I mean, I could not have this conversation with you if this was, 5 or 6 years ago.
So it's obviously an extremely sad disorder, and it affects a lot of people today. Still, there's a lot of research ongoing about what are the best ways to treat PTSD, because it is, especially as it affects our veterans, such a major issue in those communities. One note about this is that trauma is not necessarily always a bad thing. Post-traumatic growth is this idea that we can have positive psychological changes as a result of struggling with trauma. So we might reflect on ourselves and become more open, or we might, take less things for granted after struggling with a traumatic experience. Post-traumatic growth is not, I say that again, is not a symptom of PTSD, but it is a related concept. Going through trauma can cause you to eventually become better for it. It doesn't always necessarily result in PTSD or other disorders. Why is that the case? Like, what makes one person have post-traumatic growth and another person develop PTSD? We don't know yet, unfortunately. But like I said, there's a lot of research into this phenomenon ongoing. So before I leave you, let's just think about a couple ways we might explain anxiety. Why is it happening? Two main ones here. First is the behaviorist approach. So we learn anxiety and fear through conditioning. That's true, right? You think about if you are being classically conditioned to fear a certain thing. Let's say you get sprayed in the face, with a hose every time you are presented with some stimulus. You're going to learn to fear that stimulus, right? Because you don't want to get sprayed in the face. We can also learn fear through observational learning. You see something, if you see, I don't know, let's say, so here's a good example. I have a friend who, when he was little, witnessed a really graphic motorcycle crash. And despite the fact that he loves cars, he loves driving them fast now, he will never ever get on a motorcycle, and he tells me that I'm crazy for doing so because of this graphic motorcycle crash he witnessed as a child. He's observationally learned to be afraid of motorcycles. People with anxiety disorders have learned to be hypervigilant. So this, again, we're still in learning right now. They've learned to be hypervigilant, which is that constant on guardness, that constant sort of state of high alert. We can also think about it from the biological approach. When you think about it, some anxiety is good for us when it comes to natural selection and genes. If you are sort of more aware, if let's say you're in nature, you're a caveman walking around and you're dodging woolly mammoths and dinosaurs, the people who are not aware and not at all anxious, we're going to get eaten by a saber-toothed tiger, right? The cavemen who had a little bit of anxiety and were sort of on guard more, were more likely to survive. So there is an evolutionary reason behind anxiety. Genes also can influence our anxiety. There are a combination of genes that can cause some people to just be more anxious than others. In addition to that, there are some biochemical reasons. People with anxiety disorders, especially GAD, generalized anxiety disorder, have not enough serotonin and have too much glutamate. Those two neurotransmitters are off balance. And in addition to that, if you take brain scans of people with anxiety disorders, you'll notice some over-arousal, some too much activity, in other words, too much electrical stuff going on in certain brain systems, especially the amygdala in the limbic system. And in the case of PTSD, the temporal lobe, especially the left temporal lobe, tends to be a little overactive among people who have that anxiety. That is it for video 2. Hope you enjoyed. Make sure to post a question on our classroom. We'll see you on Monday. Hope you guys have a great weekend.